Right. So, American countries, Honduras and Colombia, the difference in the two sets of Lorentz curves are fairly evident. You can see uh, this has lesser inequality than this one, but both of them are unequal. The low per capita holdings of land in Asia and the high inequality of land holdings in Latin America have a similar effect. A significant fraction of the farms are owned, operated, and cultivated. In Asia, this fraction is particularly high, standing around 86%. The Latin American fraction is lower and also includes a significant fraction of very large farms that are cultivated with the use of hired labor. The African countries are somewhat of an outlier in that respect. Much of the land is held under forms of group of communal tenure, and individual claims of such plots are weak. Thus, we see that a small portion of land is under owner cultivation simply because property rights are not well defined. The reported data. So, Asian tendency is characterized by a higher incidence of sharecropping. So, in Asia, you will see that there's a lot of sharecropping, whereas if you look at um, so you'll see that in Latin America, the tenancy is largely fixed rent. Okay, whereas fixed rent is that a fixed sum of money is paid to the landlord in return for the right to cultivate on the land. Whereas Asian tenancy is characterized by high incidence of sharecropping. So in Asia, mostly you will see sharecropping, in which the tenant yields to the landlord an agreed upon share of crop. Asian fractions of tenant land under shared tenancy uh, range from around 30% in Thailand to 50% in India to 60% in Indonesia. So Indonesians give 60% of whatever they produce to their landowners, all the way up to 90% in Bangladesh. Okay. In contrast, the corresponding percentage in Latin America are much lower. In contrast, the corresponding percentage in Latin America is much lower, under 10% of countries, relatively negligible in Peru, although relatively high of 50% in Colombia. Why is the form of tenancy contract of any interest? The answer to this question must be postponed until we have examined these alternative tenancy in some great detail, but a preliminary observation or two is not out of line at this stage. Typically, rich tenants engage in fixed rent tenancy. So richer tenants जो है they allow for fixed rent tenancy. Okay, that will give a fixed amount to the landlord, because the landlord is relieved of all the risk, because the landlord knows that he is relieved of the risk. There's no risk that he will be able to pay that fixed rent. The rent is the same whether the crop does well or not. So because that tenant is rich, he knows that I will just get my money no matter what the crop is, how the crop is doing, it's good or bad. Thus, in this sense, fixed rent tenancy requires a tenant be willing and able to bear the risks of agricultural production, because he has to bear the risk of agricultural production on all on himself. No matter if the crop's going to be good, it's going to be for him. If it's going to be bad, then it's going to be for the tenant, him itself. This is generally so that the tenant has substantial wealth of his own. This is evidence of the assertion that Latin American tenancies are held by large farmers, and perhaps even evident for the conjecture that many tenancies flow from relatively poor farmers to relatively rich farmers. This concept is consistent with our discussion in the previous chapter. In a country with large landholdings, agriculture may take on a high mechanized and capitalistic form, using wage labor where labor is required. In such a regime, it may be better for small landowners to give up their lands to large owners in exchange for a rent. Okay, a country which has large landholdings. Okay, agriculture may take a highly mechanized and capitalistic form because they have so many lands, each of them, using wage labor where labor is required. So they capitalize, and wherever there is labor requirement, they just allow for wage labor. In such a regime, it is better for small landowners to give up their lands to large landowners in exchange for a rent. Okay, they just give it to the large landowners so that they can handle it, grow whatever they want to, and they will get the rent out of it. Okay. Contrast it with Asia, in which the bulk of tenancy is in the form of sharecropping. As we will see in the section that follows, sharecropping is an arrangement that has particular value when the tenant is small. So when the tenant is small and risk averse, okay, because yeah, so let's just read it further and then I explain. If a given fraction of output is paid as rent, then the tenant is to some extent insulated against output fluctuations because he can share some of his fluctuations with the landlord. This suggests that Asian tenancy probably reflects, on the whole, land leases from effective large landowners to relatively small landowners. However, be careful not to treat this as a general rule even in Asia. We will begin our study of land market by describing tenancy contracts. So, when this person is risk averse and the tenant is small, so he is very dependent on the fluctuations of the crop. If the crop goes bad, then he has nothing left to himself. Whereas if the crop is good, then it's all good. So, in the case of crop goes bad, if he has sharecropping chosen as a form of tenancy, he is going to be insulated in the sense that he will be sharing that loss with the landlord. Whereas if it's good, then it's okay, right? So sharecropping in that way is good for tenants that are small and risk averse. First, we have contractual forms. Suppose that a landowner wishes to rent out his land to a particular tenant. Several contractual forms are available. The simplest form of tenancy contract is a fixed rent contract, one in which the landlord charges a sum of money for the rental of the land and in turn allows the tenant to carry on production. So, fixed rent is that the tenant is going to give a fixed rent to the landlord for having the ability to grow whatever he wants to on the land that is available to him in exchange for a fixed rent. This sort of contract is found wherever land rentals are observed, but by no means is this the only form of contract that we observe, or even a dominant form. So this is you'll see a lot of this fixed rent contract at a lot of places, but this is by far not the most the very followed one. Okay, or and definitely not the only contract that is available. A second type of contract is commonly referred to as sharecropping. Sharecropping comes in many flavors, but all of them involve the sharing of tenants' output in some pre-assigned proportion between the landlord and tenant. Uh, The proportions vary from country to country and across regions within a country, although 50-50 division is commonly observed. Variations in the sharecropping contract include different proportions of division of the output depending on whether input costs are also shared between landlords and the tenants, and tied credit arrangements. And obviously, this division 50/50 is commonly followed, but it's definitely dependent on the fact that do they share the cost, input cost, etc. as well, and if there's a credit arrangement. Okay. The latter normally involves the advance of money by the landlord for the tenant's purchase of output. These interlinked contracts will be discussed in chapter 14. Okay. So, yeah, this is a simple but useful way to write down a class of rental contracts. This contains fixed rent and sharecropping contracts as special cases. If Y denotes agricultural output, so let us write a little bit about it here. Just find a place and write. So if Y denotes agricultural output, Y is your agricultural output. Okay, on the rented land, then the total rent is equal to rent, which is total rent is R, is equal to alpha Y. So it is directly proportional to whatever the agricultural output is going to be, plus the fixed rent of F. Okay. A fixed rent F. Now there are cases. So supposing that F is greater than 0 and alpha, I'm going to call alpha A, is equal to 0. Okay. So maybe I'll just write this down here. Big R is equal to AY plus F. Right. So in such a case, what happens is that F is greater than 0 and A is equal to 0. So the rent is absolutely not dependent on our agricultural output. So this is the case of fixed rent contract, such that the rent is now going to be equal to F. Okay. Now if F is equal to 0 and alpha lies between 0 and 1, so in this case, it is wholly dependent on the agricultural output. So this is a sharecropping contract with A or alpha being the share of landlord and 1 minus alpha being the share of tenant. Right? It's very intuitive, so I'm assuming that you understand it already, because this is the rent that you're giving to the this is the rent that you're giving to the landlord. So A is going to be the share of the landlord. Right. Now, 3, finally, if alpha is equal to 0 and F is less than 0, and alpha is equal to 0. So, in such a case, it can be interpreted as a pure wage contract. Pure wage contract. So, in that case, what exactly happens in a pure wage contract is that the landlord asks or hires labor to work for him. ठीक है? Where wage is simply is equal to F. I'm sorry, minus F. ठीक है? The tenant is not a tenant at all, but he's a laborer. Correct. That's that. Let's move on to contracts and incentives. There's a long tradition in economics that argues that sharecropping is essentially an inferior system to the fixed rent tenancy. The argument is not new.